Welcome, everyone. My name is Francina, and I am the founder and owner of Be Still Tea. And I'd like to welcome everybody to our very first tea time conversation because it is time for us to talk, it's time for us to engage, and it's time for us to act. I am the mother of 5 children, and I enter this conversation to help educate people around conversations of race, because I don't want to just be the mother who hoped for someone else to step in to make this world better. I'm going to do what I can, and so this is my step in doing what I can to make the world a better place for my children. Just some general housekeeping. This is not a political conversation. This is a human issue. And so this is a human conversation. We are in this to educate one another because I'm learning just as you will learn as well. So I want to get that clear at the beginning. The second thing is these are our perspectives and our stories. We are by no means the end all be all. We don't know all things. We're here to learn. And so we share this as a resource for those who resonate with our stories and want to learn our perspectives. So just as you listen to this conversation, come into it with that understanding. So this conversation for me is really about opening up the race conversation and providing people with tools for how to connect with themselves, which is really the mission of Be Still Tea, is to learn to be still and listen to yourself, what comes up for you around the race conversation, and then also being able to model and educate on how to connect with others with empathy. So on that note, I am so proud to have my dear friend Kathy, who is a licensed and professional counselor from Portland. She has a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and I'm just so happy that she's here to join us on this conversation as we talk about some of the background and ways that our psychology can influence how we process the world around race and how we process conversations around race, and just kind of help to, I don't know, educate us a little bit about things that may impact us and things that may hold us back from engaging in this conversation in a productive way. So welcome, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Francina, and it's really good to be with you today. Francina and I have had a number of really nice conversations about race and dynamics and family and lots of different aspects of things going on in the world that I've greatly appreciated. So I'm happy to be with her today. And I have a private practice in Portland, Oregon. And as Francina said, my master's is in marriage and family therapy. And I work a lot with couples. I work with individuals who have had a fair amount of trauma. And it isn't always trauma as in being held up with a gun by somebody, but developmental relational trauma, I call it. And I really love the work I do. And one of my goals in that work is to help people as much as I can to connect their hearts and their heads and to feel more whole and more comfortable in their own bodies. So
Wonderful. I love the experience that you bring to this conversation. So we're just going to dive right in and we're going to just talk about trauma. Could you define for us what you think trauma is, and maybe even go into some of the deeper aspects of how it could show up in our lives?
Sure. And I am going to start, Francina, with a definition of trauma that is not mine. It is Bessel van der Kolk, and he has a wonderful book out called The Body Keeps the Score, and he has done a lot of work on trauma, a lot of research, still teaching, and just has wonderful insights. So his definition, which I follow, is trauma is specifically an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. So trauma is not the story of something that happened back then. It's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside of people. So again, this isn't about just going to war. I'm not trying to minimize war because that's a huge trauma for people. This isn't about being held up, with a gun and being traumatized in that way. It's not about having your life threatened in some violent way. It is that, and it's also for kids that have grown up in homes where there's been neglect, where there's been abuse, They develop responses to trauma. Uh,
Hmm.
when you think of a small child, let's say a small child that has angry parents that fight, they fight every night.
Yeah.
And while nobody's getting hit, the verbal abuse,
Hmm.
the tones start to really frighten that child. And
Yeah.
a child that hears that night after night is having their little nervous system activated night after night.
Yeah.
And they don't have the tools to calm themselves down. They don't have the parent coming in and saying, it's okay, sweetie, we're okay, we're safe. Mommy and daddy are just fighting. They're not getting any of that. And so they begin their young lives feeling very distressed.
Okay. So kind of around that, what are some ways that that you maybe in your practice you may have seen how race can play a part in that trauma conversation? I know like for myself as a Black woman, I definitely have had things that experiences that I've had that um, may not necessarily, I would never have identified them as trauma, but now that as I've been processing things, I'm like, maybe that was traumatic for me because every time I approach this particular situation, I always feel less than, or I always feel like I don't belong in a certain space, and there's fear kind of associated with that
Mhm.
situation. So if you could talk about, um, from a racial perspective, what are some triggers that people may have around race, if you have any insight on that.
For people of color, I would imagine it's with them really on a daily community if they're stepping out into a world that is predominantly white.
Mm,
I think that just what we see, images on TV,
yeah,
what we read in the media, that there is concern about getting pulled over by the police. And that's a really scary thing for a person of color. It just
yeah,
is.
yeah,
So that is traumatic.
yeah.
Um,
And I
being
can
not,
empathize with that
can
because
you?
yes, I mean, every time I'm in the car, there is that part of me
Yeah.
that's just like, okay, I got to make sure I've got everything in here because if I get stopped by the cops, like I almost have anxiety,
Yeah.
and if God forbid I actually see a cop on the street, I mean, my palms are sweating. So I can definitely identify with that, especially when I have my children in the car, because I wouldn't want them to see anything negative happen to me
Mhm.
after being pulled over. So I think that's always something that's sitting in the back of my head. Yeah.
And that's there, and even in our system where it began with slavery, you have that trauma that's come down through generation after generation,
Yeah.
and you have people that grew up in that trauma and then they have children. You have people that lived in the South. When you look back at the old Jim Crow laws,
Hmm.
that was 100 years
Yeah.
where it was legal to have segregation, and
Yeah.
people were treated as less than and as other.
Hmm.
And that sits in a person's body, and
Yeah.
they carry it with them.
Mm.
And that's traumatizing, to
Yeah.
feel that your value is not on par with somebody else is traumatizing.
Yeah.
And it's not okay.
Yeah.
Does
Thank you for
that make
saying that.
sense? Yeah.
Yes, it does. And honestly, I think for me, there's definitely areas that I carry that trauma with me and don't realize
Mhm.
that it is trauma, but I feel
Mhm.
it every time. Like taking a walk in my neighborhood, I have anxiety about taking a walk, even though I know most of my neighbors, but there's some that I don't. And I have fear that what if they saw me and didn't think that I belonged? And that's something that I've carried with me all the time. So I'm always either with my children or I go with my husband because,
Mhm.
that makes me feel less vulnerable because,
Wow.
I don't know. But I
That's
appreciate,
pretty profound.
yeah, yeah,
That's really big, Francina.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you
Truly.
for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Truly.
Um, okay, so from there, I'm gonna kind of dive into at what point do you think, or have in your experience of you studied, where does race actually begin? Like when do people first notice race?
You know, children notice race, if you're going to call it that. And again, let's comment on race first and sort of the current thinking around the word race.
Mhm.
and that race is a social construct. It's not a scientific thing. It's
Mhm.
something we've constructed. It has shifted over the years.
Mhm.
What I learned about race when I was in school years ago is far different than what kids learn today. And as a matter of fact, when I was going to school, not that we touched on it much, but there were three races. And then I mentioned that to my grandkids as they've gone to college and they've talked about different classes they've taken. And I said, okay, well, this is what we learned. And they say, no, no, you can't say that. You can't say that. That's racist, Mima. So
Yeah.
that's what they call me. So they
Yeah.
stopped me right then and I listened to them and I learned. And it's true. As you look back, it is a social construct. So we'll talk about race. However, we're also talking about differences. Um, so kids start learning by the time they're probably between 2 and 3,
Mhm.
they are noticing differences. Um, and we help kids learn to notice differences. And when you
Mhm.
think of all the
Yeah.
games we play with our small children, um, show me all your red toys, count all the blue cars on the road.
Yeah.
We start helping them, where are all the squares? Where are all the circles? We start helping them learn to categorize things. And so categorizing people is another thing they do, just to make sense out of their world. So
Mhm.
when a child, whether it's a child of color or a child of, I don't know, I hate the white, black, but anyway,
Yeah.
um, a child that's different than them or an adult that's different than them, and they notice that difference,
Yeah.
oftentimes parents, especially if it's a person of color, then they want to shush them up. And right then they're sending a message to the child that you can't talk about that,
Yeah.
rather than just saying, oh, well, that's a brown lady, and explaining how come some people are brown and some are yellow and some are red and some are white, and that it's about where they came from, it's about their ancestral heritage.
Yeah.
It's just a difference, but we don't do that. It is laden and burdened with all kinds of meanings that don't exist.
Okay.
So, does that make sense? It's
Yes.
really important, but by the time they're going to school, they know the differences, and they also have pretty much aware of what parental attitudes are.
Yeah. Yeah.
They,
Okay, that's great, Kathy. Thank you for that. So the next question I have for you is, in your experience, at what age do the views of race become fixed or imprinted in how we see the world?
they're probably I again, I haven't read the literature on this exactly, but by the time a child is going to kindergarten, around 4 or 5, those ages, they pretty much know their family rules. They know their family views,
Mhm.
and if the family has been open to conversations about race and about differences,
Mhm.
and been without any moral judgment around it,
Yeah.
then the children are open to incorporating into their world whoever they incorporate into their world. If it's a closed family that has a lot of biases about things, doesn't like new things, new people, or anything in the system, then I think those kids' views are going to stay pretty steady to what their parents are. Where the open system, um, kids, I mean, they know about race, they know about difference, but it really isn't something that it's fluid,
Yeah.
where the
It
other's
is something.
stagnant. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? Yeah, one's going to be
Absolutely.
fluid, one's going to be set.
Okay. Okay. And so, at what role then do you find in your experience does loyalty to family play in our views and our ability to change that? Because I feel like if you're born into a closed family and you're now an adult and all this racial tension is happening in our world right now, what role is your loyalty to what you came from playing in how well you can be open to seeing what is out there now?
It's pretty profound. In a closed system, the rules don't change a lot. In family systems theory, a nuclear family is established, like you and Christoph and your 5 children have formed a family.
Yeah.
And you've set up a set of guidelines to how the family functions. And if there isn't room for other people at the table, then the kids are going to pick that up, that we don't get to invite other people in.
Yeah.
And adherence to the family rules that you've set now as part of your identity of being in this family can get pretty entrenched. And so that as soon as a child wants to try something different, they might be kind of shunned, mild shunning from the family,
Yeah.
reminded that you're not one of us, reminded that we don't think like that, we don't do things that way. There's a lot of what we do. And so even as an adult, if you haven't broken away from that, to
Mhm.
break away from it even as an adult means you're going to be very likely ostracized from the family. At least it feels that way. So it makes it really difficult to shift your views.
Yeah.
And even if you start shifting them, it makes it difficult to share your views or to stand up for something that you believe in that the
Yeah.
family doesn't agree with.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's pretty hard, depending.
It
The
is.
open system, you can have different views, you can do things differently, and the family loves you for who you are.
Yeah. And I think there is something to be said where I feel like sometimes families may aspire to be open systems. For example, they're teaching their children, hey, we love all people. Everybody is created in God's image. We should treat all people the same. And then throw in your white child begins dating a Black person. And suddenly you're confronted with, oh, how open really am I?
Yeah.
And, because I mean, I experienced that in my own life. I think that sometimes our history influences what we look at as this is what is normal
Mhm.
versus, everybody could get to choose whatever they want. And I know that in my own life, that's sort of something that we were confronted with when we first wanted to get married. I mean, everything is great. And, I understand that my parents' trepidation was not because they were racist necessarily, but that, they came from systems where to be married to someone like that could mean harm to them. Right.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
yeah, yeah. So anyways,
Is it, but that's really, I mean, that's something really to ponder when we think about having conversations with other people, that can really influence
yeah.
somebody, who
Yeah.
they choose to marry.
Right, right. And my parents love my husband and
Mhm.
they adore him. But I think that before you know somebody,
Mhm.
which is actually why these conversations are so, so important. That's why I'm
Mhm.
doing this, is because when we actually allow ourselves to walk past the divide and actually talk to someone and learn of that
Mhm.
person, the guard comes down and we
Yeah.
realize we're really just all human at the end of it all.
It's true. And
Yeah.
your parents, was any of theirs based on their fear from the way things used to be that was sort of
I would
embedded in
imagine
them?
so. Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, I've not had too many like in-depth conversations with them, but I know that they grew up in a society that was very, very segregated,
Mhm.
and they experience a lot of harm from white people. And
Mhm.
so, for them, almost felt like a betrayal for me to go and marry somebody who was different than what they were. But,
Right. Right.
I think that there's been a lot of growth and healing and all of that stuff in our world. And, but that's part of my story, so I can totally empathize with, family systems and all of that stuff. So we're going to move into here a little bit and talk about what makes people react the way that they choose to react, in terms of, uh, do you feel like it's tied specifically to their family relationships, or like, because I'm noticing a lot of times when people are confronted with any kind of racial conversation, the immediate is either they wall up and there's defensiveness and a need to feel like they've got to prove something. And it's not always a posture of, oh, thank you for sharing that with me. Let me
Mhm.
process that.
Mhm. I think you said it really well. I do. I mean, I think it can start with that defensiveness,
Yeah.
or I'm not like that, or thinking
Mhm.
that somebody assumes that someone is like that, whatever that is. And we can become very guarded.
Mhm.
I often think for white people when it comes to discussing issues of differences around color that kind of want to shrug off a sense of maybe guilt, where you've got generations of trauma. I can't help
Yeah.
but wonder if we don't have generations of guilt on
Yeah.
the other side, and
Yeah.
we don't want to own that, and I think we have to. So,
Yeah.
I think for any of us, difficult conversations, we really have to learn to set ourselves aside and open up our hearts and minds to just listen and try to understand.
Okay. Yeah.
That's hard.
Good. Actually, that ties in perfectly with my next question, which is what would be your definition of shame? Because I feel like a lot of things that stand in the way is the shame that comes up in us. And sometimes people don't even realize that it's shame that's
Right.
making them feel like, hey, I got to protect something here, you
Right.
know? So,
There are a lot of them out there. For me, shame is really contempt against yourself. It's
mm,
feeling like you're less than, like you're not worthy, like you're not valuable.
okay.
Yeah.
And then tied to that, what would be your definition of empathy?
Empathy for me is really, really working to try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to really try to understand, to imagine what it's like for them, to ask
Yeah.
questions that help you understand what it's like for them,
Hmm.
and to sit with that, to not try to get rid of it, to sit with that, to
Hmm.
really try to see, to feel their pain
Yeah.
and their joy. Sometimes we get to, if we do that, we get to practice that and feel somebody else's joy too. And that's
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
special.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That is. Yeah. I think it's an important part of the human experience to feel
it is.
both the good and the difficult parts of life. I think that's what makes us human because we
Mm-hmm.
cannot escape those emotions. We can't escape the grief and sadness and stuff like that that comes with our lives. So
Oh,
so for the next section on the engagement, we're going to break it up into two parts. The first is going to be engagement with ourselves and then engagement with others with empathy. So beginning with ourselves, what are some barriers that prevent people from learning to be still and learn to just sit and listen to the things that are coming up for them around the race conversation?
well, the race conversation, and I'd have to say a lot of conversations. Doing the work I do, I can't tell you how many people are really uncomfortable sitting with their own feelings
Mhm.
and encouraging them to embrace the feelings as information. So around race, if
I
they
like
have
that. Embrace the feelings as information.
information, yeah.
That's beautiful.
Having discomfort around talking about race doesn't mean you're racist, but it does mean you're going to have to open up and try to understand your feelings and where they come from.
Mm, that's
You
good.
know,
Yeah.
so but I do think that it's creating the time, creating the space, and then sitting with the discomfort, knowing that feelings pass, they're not permanent, no feeling is final.
Yes,
And frankly, I think that we need to feel a little uncomfortable about those conversations because we haven't had them.
that's
We
true.
haven't had honest,
That's true.
caring, empathic conversations with most of us, with very many people in
Yeah.
our lives.
Yeah.
And it's time.
Yeah. I like.
So, yeah.
So I guess maybe you've touched on this a little bit, but why is it so uncomfortable for us to open ourselves up and confront the systems that we're born into or systems that we find ourselves in?
That's kind of the $1 million question. No, we have trouble opening up. We really do. Fear of judgment,
Mm,
fear of being kicked out of a group,
yeah, that's
loss
true.
of connection,
Yeah,
not being able to belong.
right.
It's why it's really important that we have a place that we have connection and belonging to go back to, kind of our own soft place to land as adults.
Yes.
Because we know that when we start opening up these conversations, we might get kicked around a little bit.
Hmm.
And extending empathy and caring to somebody else doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get it back. And I think you have to be ready for that.
Yeah,
When I think about opening up difficult conversations with people of color, I can't imagine why in the world they should trust a white person.
yeah.
Really,
I
yeah,
honestly, I can empathize with what you're saying too, because I feel like I have just sort of become conditioned to have a measure of skepticism when I meet a white person who acts like they really care.
Mm-hmm.
Because in my mind, I'm like, let's see if they'll still be here in a month, you know, let's see if they'll still be here, you know, because that's been my experience,
Mm-hmm.
that I have felt at times like I was sort of the nice to know brown person that makes you not look racist
Mm-hmm.
or makes you not look like you have any kind of prejudice because you know me. But do you really know me? Do you really stay engaged and stay wanting to know more about me and more about my life?
Yeah.
In my experience, it hasn't been that people have stuck around, you know. So this is a really good point.
So my empathy's kicking in with that one, Francina.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, so yeah, my next question here is, what role does shame and empathy play in our ability to connect with ourselves and our emotions?
Well, shame is going to be a huge deterrent to connect with ourselves and with others. People that hold a great deal of shame, again, they're going to want to have a group that they connect with. They're not going to want to be kicked out of the group. They're
Mhm.
going to find their worth and value by having that group accept them.
Okay.
And so it's going to be hard for them to have authentic relationships. Empathy opens us up to that, because
Yeah.
when we can be empathic without judgment and just hold the space and be in conversation with somebody and manage our own feelings that come up, because we will have feelings that come up, it's normal,
Yeah.
then we can engage far
Yeah.
more easily.
I would, you know, I just want to add here too for some of um, our white friends that may be watching this and may feel like maybe you thought a certain way and then you started learning and your perspective is changing,
Mhm.
to go back and interact with some of your friends that are not on the same path and not wanting to embrace um, truths that are coming up for you, you know, that it, just like you were talking about wanting to belong, right? We all want to belong, you know,
Mhm.
and this is definitely something that you're going to have to sit with a little bit and figure out how important it is to stay belonging to a certain group if that group is no longer in alignment with some of the things that you're learning, you know. And then being able to just talk about those things with people that are growing as well, you know.
Mhm.
um, yeah, I just wanted to put that out there because I think I definitely have friends that I've been speaking to that are like, wow, I meet a lot of people that I care about that I thought the same way, but now I'm changing and they haven't,
Mm. Right,
you know.
right.
So it's hard to feel like that. Sometimes it's like you're being given shame for changing your perspective, if you will, because you were all in the same group before, you know?
Right.
Yeah,
And we do shift. We do shift. Hopefully, if we're growing, we're shifting.
yeah,
And
yeah,
we don't all shift in the same direction.
that's true.
And some people may take a little longer to shift.
Yeah. Okay, and so now we're going to segment into talking about others. So after we've spent some time engaging with ourselves and we know where we are sitting and what we're feeling, what are some barriers to engaging with people with empathy around this conversation?
Some barriers. I think judgment's huge.
Yeah.
I'm always interested to hear how many times it might come up in my thinking or out of my mouth or around other people.
Mhm.
Just pronouns of them, those.
Uh,
Those are words that don't really have a definition and yet they're huge. Does that
mhm.
make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So I think that is a big barrier, that when we are have prejudged a group, prejudged a neighborhood, prejudged a shopping center. I mean, we judge all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And when those judgments prohibit us from engaging with others, I think we're in trouble.
Yeah, I actually can recall a time I was in a conversation with somebody and they referred to people, African Americans, as the
Okay.
blacks to me, because for some reason I'm in a different category, but because they were a different whatever in their minds, they refer to them as a group of the Blacks. And I'm just like, yeah, I think it's really important for people to pay attention to what kind of language they've used to describe a whole group of people, which, I feel like we're not really seeing their humanity when we're labeling them one word. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's just it is, but that judgment's a tough one.
yeah. Okay. Um, why would you, like in your experience, what have you seen in terms of like what are some things that cause people to shy away from those difficult interactions? Because it's like it seems reasonable for us to just sit down and have a conversation, but I've not seen many go really well because I feel like people are either attacking or they're trying to maybe fight off their own shame that's coming up, or they're taking on things that someone is saying that may not necessarily be directed at them, but I don't know, it's hard to figure out. So I just wanted you to kind of speak to if you have anything in your experience that you can explain why people tend to be not wanting to have those difficult conversations.
Well, I think they're hard. I think they're hard. I think they're uncomfortable for people. And I've noticed that when somebody wants to talk to us about something that's hard, we have a tendency to automatically be defensive. And so we start listening with listening, doing nodding, doing all the I'm listening cues to another person while we're actually in our head putting together our rebuttal. So we haven't learned to actually listen and listen to understand. And when somebody wants to have a hard conversation, the most important thing is try to listen to understand what they're trying to tell you.
I like that.
To be curious about whatever somebody's saying means to them. And if you're able to set up a hard conversation, then you can consider timing. When's a good time to have those conversations? Make sure you're rested, make sure you're fed. And if somebody pulls you into a conversation you're not ready for, you can always say, I would love to talk to you right now, but at this moment I don't have the bandwidth, so I'm going to give you a call tomorrow, however you need to handle it. But I think the discomfort and the lack of listening, I'll tell you, that's huge, because I do couples work.
Yeah.
And couples listen to rebut. They don't listen to understand.
That's so true. So true. And I definitely have experienced that I feel like people are immediately on the defense to want to prove how what you're saying is not really as important or not really pertinent to them. And this is why it's not pertinent to me, because I have, and then fill in the blank. So yeah, I think it's really important for people to understand that seeing another human being and seeing their experience is best when you actually listen to understand and not listen to figure out what you're going to say next. Now we are going to dive into the last part, which is the action part of our conversation. I am a firm believer that we can only love and connect with others to the degree that we love and connect with ourselves. And so in doing that, I believe we need to kind of approach these conversations with ourselves from a place of love, empathy, and acceptance without shaming ourselves, because I feel like shame closes us up, and we want to grow and we want to be more open. And so with that, what are some practical ways that we can approach this race conversation so that we can dive in and grow?
Okay. I'm going to speak right now more for white people, and I don't mean it in a shaming way, because it's certainly something that I am doing, making every effort to do myself. And that is for ourselves, I think we need to be reading, and I think we need to be reading books, reading articles, listening to podcasts, listening to the stories of people of color, to understand their story. And that when we want to have those conversations, that we're bringing something to the party, so to speak, that we're
Mhm.
bringing something to the conversation, that we're asking questions about what we've learned, that we are not placing more burden on the backs of people of color because they've already had those burdens placed on them for years. And we need to take responsibility for understanding and accepting where we are. And we do live in a place of white privilege. We've grown up in a culture that has had systemized and institutionalized racism for all of its years.
Yeah.
And we need to be part of the solution. And that is learning and growing and understanding.
Yeah. I think this is a true thing to say, but I come at it because I want people to stay in this conversation. This is hard work, people. It is hard work. And I realize that for the majority of white people, if they did nothing, their lives probably wouldn't change, which is a testament to the whole privilege conversation we're having here, that you can do nothing and your life will stay the same. But I want to challenge you that doing something means that we are stepping into this conversation for the greater good of all people. And my life will change because you're joining this conversation. My children's lives will change because you're joining this conversation. And so I want to just, express my gratitude for those of you who have been doing the work and are and those who are working towards doing the work. I invite you to stay with it, because your awareness and your action will mean that me and my children will have a better future living in this country. So thank you for that. I also want to just point out too, like some great books that people can be reading. Wonderful book by Latasha Morrison, Be the Bridge. Just got the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by, remind me, Kathy.
Ibram X. Kendi.
Yeah. Do you have any other books that you would mention?
Yes, I've got I'm Still Here by Austin Channing Browning. It's very excellent. So you want to talk about race. I can't say her last name. White Fragility. It's a good one.
Yes.
There is a woman that teaches here in Portland, at Portland State. She has a book called Post-Traumatic Stress Syndrome.
Okay.
Or Slave Syndrome. I'm sorry, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome.
Okay.
Very good. The New Jim Crow Laws. One of my very favorite, and then I have Ibram X. Kendi's book on Stamped from the Beginning about racism. There's another book too that is, it's not necessarily specifically about race, but it's called Blind Spot, and it's about implicit bias. And it might help you see, if you're wrestling with that, it might help all of us see where our biases are and how they show up. And so that's good. And one of my very favorite books that I love, and it's huge, is this one, The Warmth of Other Suns. And one of the things I love about that book is it's history. It's about the migration of African Americans from the South from 1915 to the 1970s. And she humanizes the history. She tells the story in there. She has historical pieces like factual stuff. And then she tells that through the stories of 3 different people. And it is so powerful. Those people, you carry them with you after you close the book.
Wow.
So it's a wonderful story to help you read more, book to find out more about people's real life experience. What it was really like.
Okay. And then what are some things that we can put into practice to help us practice empathy with others and with ourselves? Okay.
Practicing empathy, really drop into yourself to really sit down with a cup of tea and explore your own biases, and to have empathy for yourself in the process, because they're going to be there and they can bring up a sense of shame. But we live in a meaning-making culture,
Yeah.
And some of our meanings are really off.
Yeah.
They really are off. And they do harm to self and they do harm to other.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm with Francina. Our kids need to have a better world, and that's
Yeah.
up to us to create that for them. So I think to understand, to accept, and to really accept that we truly do live in a culture that many have referred to as a caste system. You're reading that more in some of the literature.
Yeah.
That there are layers, and people are kept in a certain layer
Yeah.
in our country, and we're supposed to be different than that,
Yeah.
and we will be more valuable if we can really honor that.
Yeah. That's really good. That's really good. I just want to add here too that I know for myself, I've practiced um, through drinking tea,
Mm-hmm.
just taking inventory of where I am, what am I struggling with, and writing. I just wanted to add that for those of you who may
Yeah.
never have taken up journaling, but if there's discomfort on anything, on any level for you, sitting with that, figuring out what is the discomfort about, is there something I can do to address it? Is it my responsibility? And if it is, what can you actively do to make a change so that this doesn't keep coming up for you? You know, so that's one of the ways that I've taken to dealing with challenging things that have come up for me in my own life. Writing has really been a tool for me to process those emotions, and I think we have to process them, because when we don't
Mm-hmm.
and we stuff them up, they come up some way at some point, right? You've heard the saying that when you squeeze a toothpaste, what's on the inside comes out.
Oh,
And so if we're not processing, we're just stuffing things in there. And I feel like this is a time where we really need to process our thoughts and our emotions that are coming up as we begin having these conversations. So
and I
the
think,
last,
there's real quick, there's an
yeah,
advantage to doing the journaling like you do, is that you get to look back and see your growth.
that's true.
And I think
True.
that record around something as powerful as this, and
Yeah.
to keep track of the benefits,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it's great.
Okay. So my last question, what are some good reminders for people to think about as they enter the race conversation? And we're breaking it up into two parts for white people, and then I'll answer the one for Black people.
Okay. Well, for white people, again, to really, really recognize, and I can't stress this enough, that racism is part of our system, and um, it can't be ignored. And this is for future generations. This is to create a better world. This is for you. It's for me. It's for Francina. It's for the children. It's for kids that aren't yet born. And I would just challenge anybody that's white to really not give themselves a pass because they didn't create the system. If we're not taking, our action or inaction can sustain the system. And so it's up to us to change it.
Yeah.
Systems change. When you look at generational trauma, it continues down to the generations until one generation, even just one person, decides this is going to be different.
Yeah.
And they do get in and they do the work and they make the change. And that's now our responsibility, is try to really work hard to systemically change this and to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Yeah. I like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think for me, just from the perspective of what would be most meaningful to me, I remember when I first started posting videos, every couple days I was getting text messages from my white friends. How are you doing? How are you doing? Well, I don't get them anymore. And I'm going to choose not to believe it's not because I don't matter anymore, because I know I matter. But I think and I hope that people are diving in and doing the work. And what would be meaningful to me is for you to reach out to me and say, hey, I'm working through this. Do you have time for us to have a conversation? Because I just want to understand better from your perspective. Or, reaching out, not just to say, how are you doing so you can ease your conscience that you checked on me, but what's most meaningful to me is, are you doing the work? And these are some action steps that you're doing to change what you have been doing in your, as you've been gaining awareness. I think that it's easy in the heat of the moment to sort of take on uh, some shame or guilt around the race conversation, and then feel like by checking on someone that you know who's brown, you've done a good thing. But really, what's really going to benefit us is for you to stay in the conversation and then talk about what you're learning. Talk about the barriers that you're struggling with as you interact with your children, because I'm having those conversations with my children, and I'm having them with them regularly over and over again, because this is not something that's just going to change because one day you had a conversation and you were aware of something and then nothing happened with that. You've got to stay in it. If we want our children to grow up and not have to deal with the things we're dealing with now, we have to deal with them now. And I think the example of your work on this conversation teaches your children so much more than the one or two movies you made them watch and the one conversation you had at the dining room table will ever do. How you show up in the world makes a difference. So, yeah. So in closing, I guess, would you have any closing statements that you wanted to add at the end?
But just that right now we have an opportune moment. There's a lot of conflict in the world. There's a lot of information out there. This is something you can find information on every single day. And it's a time of growth, and we don't want to miss the opportunity. When I think of the images I see on TV, when I think of the Black people I see being killed out in the open, in open spaces with people watching, and knowing that children are watching that, knowing that Francina's children might see that, it really, really breaks my heart. And I would hope that as white people, that we would watch that and we would let our hearts be broken, and that we would let them be broken open, and we would let the empathy sink in, and that we would pull ourselves back together, and we would go about and try to be agents of change and learn and grow and create a better place for all of our kids.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. That's beautiful. Really beautiful. Um, yeah, I think the end for me is we need each other for this to really have a lasting change. Like I said earlier, for most white people, doing nothing won't impact your life, but doing something will impact my life. And so I know that all people matter. And I want to speak to the person who wants to end there and say all people matter. Stay in this conversation, because if all people matter, then this is a conversation we all need to be in. I want us to keep asking difficult questions, keep doing the work. And yeah, if we're going to make this world better for our children, we've got to do the work. So I just appreciate you all for coming with us on this journey, for learning with us, for growing with us. And I look forward to our next Tea Time conversation. Thank you so much, Kathy, for being a part of this.
Oh, thank you. My privilege.
Such an honor. Yeah, look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.